Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Let us travel in the mind's slow eye to where the water meets the land in a great, gentle embrace. To the northern shores of Nalubali, the mother of waters, whom others call Lake Victoria. Here, the air is soft with mist in the morning, and heavy with the scent of moist earth and ripe plantain in the afternoon. The kingdom here is one of hills, rolling like the steady breath of a sleeping giant, covered in a blanket of deep green. Banana leaves, broad and generous, catch the sunlight and break it into 1,000 dancing coins on the shaded ground below. This is Buganda, and its heart beats not in a chest of flesh, but in a stone. For here, authority was not merely declared, it was quarried. It was a thing of geography before it was a thing of genealogy. The king, the Kabaka, did not simply rule from a palace. He ruled from a specific piece of the earth, lifted from a specific hillside and shaped by silent, sacred hands. His throne was not carved from wood, which can burn, or forged from metal, which can melt. It was hewn from the very bedrock of the kingdom itself. To understand Buganda, one must understand this stone, not as furniture, but as a covenant, a compact between the lineage of man and the memory of the land. The story we will unwind tonight, in the quiet company of this fire, is the story of that stone. It is a story that begins with the earth speaking in tremors and the sky writing in the flight of birds. It is a story of growth, not of a tree, but of a plinthage, added rock, a decade of peace, a chapter of stability written in geology. It is a story of a violent departure, a theft across seas, and a return so shrouded in mystery that the stones themselves arrived wet with the salt of a journey no human could explain. And it ends, in our present age, not with a king upon his throne, but with a king standing respectfully beside it, choosing a simple chair, believing the throne's accumulated power too immense, too sacred, for these diminished times. This is a narrative of weight, the physical weight of granite and basalt, the historical weight of lineage, the spiritual weight of a nation's soul anchored to a single, silent object. As we begin, let us shed the modern impulse for speed, for quick answers. Here, under these imagined baobab skies, we move at the pace of stone formation, at the pace of a tree adding a single, silent ring. We listen for the stories that are not shouted, but whispered by the land itself. Let's pause for a moment. Listen to the gentle crackle of our fire, a small, warm echo of the ancient volcanic fires that first formed the stones of Negalabi. The night breathes around us, deep and full. To sit upon the stone throne of Buganda was to become the living apex of a mountain made not of one king, but of all who came before. The seat connected the ruler to the dust of his ancestors and to the unyielding foundation of his country. It was the ultimate expression of being of a place, not just in it. The king's body, upon that stone, completed a circular flow of legitimacy from the earth, through the stone, through the lineage, and out to the people. It was less a seat of power than a conduit for it, and like all things of true, deep power, its story is one of creation, reverence, violation, mystery, and ultimately a profound and respectful silence. So, settle into the stillness. Let the images of misty hills, of silent quarrymen, of a ship cutting through grey ocean, and of a solitary stone seat in an empty hall, form in the quiet theatre of your mind. We are about to trace the journey of a rock that was a kingdom, and a kingdom that was, in its heart, a rock. The journey of the stone throne. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories from under the bow. Have you ever wondered how an ancient kingdom chose its leader? Not with ballots or battles, but by listening to the very earth itself. Today, we journey to the heart of Buganda, to a time when the land had the final say, By the end of our story, you'll understand how the ground beneath their feet was consulted to choose the foundation of a kingdom, and why one specific hillside, Negalabi, became the sole source of royal authority. This isn't just history. It's a story of a deep, living connection between a people and their world. The selection of a king's stone was an event that stopped the ordinary heartbeat of the kingdom. It was a process steeped in reverence, a ritual that did not begin in the gilded halls of the palace, but in the quiet, humble compounds of the seers and the earth priests, the Abafumu. When Akabaka, the king, passed on and joined his ancestors, a solemn delegation would leave the capital. Mengo, their destination was not a place of political power, but of spiritual significance. The hill known as Nak. This journey was not one of haste, but of profound deliberation. It was a pilgrimage of purpose. Negalabi itself was not the tallest hill in the region, nor was it the most lush or verdant. From a distance, it might have seemed unremarkable, but to those who knew how to listen, it held a certain density of spirit, a gravity. The rocks scattered across its slopes were not mere rubble. They were considered the concentrated bones of the land, the solidified essence of Buganda's primordial past. Each stone was a word, each outcrop a sentence in the land's long memory. The ritual of choosing the king's stone was a dialogue, not a conquest. The priests, the Abafumu, did not command the earth to give up its treasure. They didn't arrive with tools to break and take. Instead, they came to listen, to wait for the earth to offer its chosen peace. For 3 days and 3 nights, they would fast and keep a silent, watchful vigil on the hillside. They shed their daily comforts, sleeping on the cool grass, their ears pressed to the ground, as if trying to hear the planet's deep, slow pulse. They believed that in this state, their dreams would be filled with visions of stones, guiding them. They didn't just listen with their ears. They observed with their entire being. They watched the creatures of the air and the land, seeing them as messengers. The flight pattern of a pair of hornbills, circling a specific outcrop before flying away, was not a coincidence. It was a sentence in a divine text, a signpost. The sudden appearance of a certain breed of black ant building its mound overnight in a particular spot was an underlined word, drawing their attention. And then there were the tremors, the slight, subtle shivers of the land that often precede a distant earthquake, imperceptible to most. These were the clearest voice of all. A gentle tremor originating from deep within a specific part of the hill was interpreted as the hill itself gesturing, pointing, saying, "Here, the stone for your king sleeps here." It was a confirmation, a whisper from the very core of the kingdom. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine yourself on that hill. The sun has set, and a fire crackles gently, its light dancing on the faces of the priests. The cool night air breathes around you. In the distance, an owl calls a sound perhaps not unlike the hornbill's cry that might have signified a royal stone earlier that day. Feel the immense patience of that hillside vigil, the stillness, the focus, the absolute faith in the signs the world was giving them. This wasn't superstition. This was science of the deepest kind, an ecology of omens. It was built upon a fundamental belief that the kingdom of Buganda was a single, living organism. The rivers were its veins, the forests its lungs, the people its heart, and the king was its head. Therefore, the stone that would physically support the head, the coronation stone upon which the new king would sit, had to be in perfect harmony with the entire body of the kingdom. A stone chosen from the wrong place, or in the wrong way, would create a king out of sync with his land. This was not a risk to be taken lightly. It was a recipe for disaster. Drought, discord among the clans, famine, and disease. The harmony between the ruler and the realm was paramount, and it all began with this single, foundational choice. Once the signs converged and the tremors confirmed the location, the chosen site was marked, but not with a painted cross or a carved stake. It was consecrated with a delicate, symbolic gesture. The priests would create a perfect circle on the ground using pure white ash, and at the exact center of this circle, they would place a single, unblemished white hen's egg. This egg was a powerful symbol of potential, of a reign yet to be born, fragile and full of promise, just like the egg itself. It signified new life, the dawn of a new era for the kingdom, resting upon the ancient strength of the stone beneath. The knowledge of how to listen to the earth's subtle language was not learned from books. It was hereditary, a sacred trust passed down through specific lineages of priests sworn to the service of the land. These families understood that the earth's language was not one of words, but of relationships, the intricate connection between rock and root, between a tremor deep underground and the swaying of a tree, between the flight of a bird and the direction of the breeze. Their entire lives were a dedicated study in this silent grammar. They were the interpreters between the natural world and the human one. So when one of these priests finally pointed a finger, it was the culmination of this intense, multisensory investigation. He was not indicating a random rock. He was completing a sentence that the hill of Negalabi had been speaking for centuries. They were identifying the one piece of the hill that held within it the precise, cosmic balance of steadfastness and spirit, of ancient endurance and vibrant energy. This was the quality required to anchor a man who, in turn, must anchor an entire nation. The stone wasn't just a seat, it was a conduit, a connection that would channel the strength of the land into the reign of the new Kabaka. The process of excavating the stone was just as reverent as its selection. It wasn't a matter of brute force. The priests and designated clansmen would work with meticulous care, speaking to the stone, explaining its purpose, asking its permission to be moved. They believed that the spirit of the stone needed to be respected for it to fulfill its royal duty. The tools used were often traditional, and the work was timed to coincide with auspicious moments in the cycles of the moon and sun. Once freed from the earth, the stone wasn't just a heavy rock, it was now a sacred object, imbued with the authority of Nagabi. It was wrapped carefully in fresh barcloth and carried in a solemn procession back towards the capital. This journey was not a triumphant parade, but a slow, respectful transfer of power. The stone was now the physical embodiment of the land's consent for the new king. It was the promise of stability, the anchor of legitimacy. Back at the site of the coronation, the stone would be prepared and placed. It became the centerpiece of the most important ritual in the kingdom. The king-to-be would be brought before it, and in the climax of the ceremony, he would be seated upon this very stone. This act was far more than a man sitting on a rock. It was the moment the new king was plugged into the land. He was accepting its authority and, in turn, receiving its strength. From that moment on, his rule was not just by birthright, but by the explicit sanction of the earth itself, as interpreted by the wisest men and the subtlest signs of nature. This incredible tradition shows us a worldview where humanity is not separate from or superior to nature, but is an integral part of it. The health of the land and the health of the society were seen as one and the same. The king's authority wasn't absolute. It was conditional, granted by the very ground he ruled. Nagalabi Hill wasn't just a quarry for coronation stones. It was the ultimate source of political and spiritual legitimacy, the place where every new reign had to begin, by listening to the deep, silent voice of the earth. We witnessed the sacred consecration of Nagalabi Hill, preparing the ground for a monumental task. Now, with the spiritual stage set, a new group of protagonists enters our story. They are not priests robed in white, but men whose hands speak a language older than words. They are the Royal Stonecutters, the Abasazi Bamanya, a guild so revered, so secretive, its membership was a sacred trust, passed down from a father to only his most careful and deserving son. Imagine a brotherhood bound by oaths more binding than any chain, their lips sealed more effectively than any lock. They weren't just craftsmen, they were keepers of ancient knowledge, masters of a silent art. Their world was one of stone, patience, and profound respect. They knew the songs the chisel sings as it meets granite, the slow, unfolding poetry of patience. Their task was not to conquer the stone, not to break its will, but to persuade it, to gently coax a destined block from the living embrace of the hill, without a fracture, without a single flaw. It was an act of delicate separation, like carefully lifting a sleeping child from its mother's loving arms. Picture the scene. A man in the prime of his life, his body a testament to years of labor, powdered in the fine grey dust of his calling. His focus is absolute, his eyes tracing a line only he can truly see on the vast granite face. His hands, strong and steady, hold the tools of his trade. These weren't complex machines, they were simple, few, and sacred. An iron chisel, its metal smelted in furnaces that had burned for generations, carrying the spirit of his ancestors. A heavy mallet carved from the mighty emvule tree, a wood famous for its unyielding strength and steadfastness. And beside him, a gourd of water, not just any water, but water blessed by the Nalinya, the king's own sister, imbuing it with spiritual power. These men did not use brute force. They did not blast the rock apart or drive wedges into its heart. Their method was a symphony of precise percussion and controlled thermal shock, a dance between fire and water. First, a fine, shallow line would be meticulously scored along the intended fracture plane, a declaration of intent whispered to the stone. Then, along this line, small, controlled fires were built. They used specific, fast-burning grasses, chosen for the intense, direct heat they produced. The fire would lick at the stone, heating the surface along that precise line. The stonecutters would watch, their senses heightened. They judged the exact moment not by a clock, but by the shifting color of the flame and the sound the stone itself made, a low, almost inaudible sigh as the heat expanded its surface. At that perfect, critical instant, the blessed water from the gourd would be splashed along the fiery line. The sudden, extreme change in temperature, the quenching of the heat, would send a shockwave through the granite. The sound that followed was not a violent explosion or a jarring crash. It was a deep, resonant pop, a sigh of release, as if the great Mother Rock was exhaling, offering up its chosen portion. It was the clean, pure sound of a perfect birth. And there it was, a massive block, a rough, rectangular mass, taller than a man and wider than his outstretched arms, now sat free. It rested upon a specially prepared bed of softer earth, cushioned with large, rolled logs, ready for the next stage of its journey. But the work was not met with cheers or celebration. In the face of this monumental achievement, the stonecutters would do something remarkable. They would kneel. They would press their foreheads against the cool, newly exposed face of the mother rock they had just parted from, and they would whisper their thanks. A moment of deep, silent communion and gratitude. Only then would they turn their attention to the child stone. The first, most basic shaping would begin smoothing the base that would one day meet the earth of the coronation site, and smoothing the top that would, one day, meet a king. Let's just pause here for a moment. As the fire crackles and the night breathes around us, take a second to truly imagine the scene. Imagine the intense, silent focus of those men. Their entire world, their entire consciousness, reduced to the sharp point of a chisel. The intricate grain of the rock, the steady, rhythmic pattern of their breath and their blows. It wasn't just labor, it was a meditation in granite. A conversation conducted not with words, but with vibration, rhythm, and an understanding that transcended the physical. Each tap of the mallet was a question posed to the stone. This was a process that could not be rushed. It could take many moons, following a schedule dictated not by a foreman, but by the stone's own willingness to yield. To hurry was to risk creating a hidden fissure, an invisible, fatal flaw that could compromise the entire project, that could shatter the king's throne before it was ever even built. During this time, the stonecutters lived in a temporary village built right there on the hillside. Their food was brought to them, and their contact with the outside world was minimal, almost non-existent. They were in seclusion, in communion with the stone. Day after day, week after week, they became attuned to the stone's unique personality. Was it stubborn today? Was it yielding? They learned its moods through the feedback that traveled up the chisel, into their hands, their arms, their very bones. Every strike was a question, and the stone's response the way a flake of rock flew off the specific ring of the chisel as it struck was the answer. This was a dialogue, a slow, patient getting to know you. By the end of this long, arduous process, the block was not just shaped into a rough form. It was known, it had been introduced through a million tiny conversations hammered out over months to the sacred purpose it was destined to serve. It was no longer just a random piece of Nagalabi Hill. It had been transformed. It was now the stone, a singular entity imbued with the focus, the spirit, and the respect of the men who had freed it. It was ready, awaiting the immense journey from its birthplace on the hill to the coronation ground, where it would finally become a throne fit for a Kabaka. The skill and patience are just mind-boggling, aren't they? This story reminds us that the greatest things are often built not with force, but with understanding and respect. The journey from the sacred hill of Nagalabi to the royal palace at Mengo was a transformation. It was the moment the stone ceased to be a geological secret and became a national spectacle, a public covenant. This wasn't just about moving a rock. It was about forging a kingdom. The stone did not travel in a simple cart pulled by beasts. No, that would have been too easy, too mundane. It was moved by the raw muscle and sweat of the people along a path of rolled logs, a method as ancient as the hills themselves. This was entirely deliberate. The very foundation of the throne had to be carried by the people it would symbolically support. It was the first physical act of a shared burden and, more importantly, a shared destiny. Imagine this scene, a long, winding line of Buganda men. Their bodies strong and clad in traditional barcloth loincloths. They are straining together, muscles bunched, pulling on massive ropes that are themselves works of art. The stone, a giant grey block, rests not on wheels but on a heavy sledge made of logs. This sledge rolls over a pathway of other logs laid down ahead by another team, a continuous, slow-moving conveyor belt of wood and human will. Behind them, the lush green hills of Buganda roll away into the distance. Witnesses to this monumental effort, the process began with incredible precision. Levers crafted from strong MVOL wood, one of the hardest and most resilient timbers in the land, would be used to carefully lift the massive stone onto the sledge. Once positioned, thick ropes, woven with incredible skill from banana fibers and sinew, were secured around it, creating a harness to contain its immense weight. Then, the chosen pullersmen selected from every single clan, representing the totality of the kingdom, would take their positions along the ropes. There was no hierarchy here. Every man was equal in this task. A low, chanting call would echo from the lead puller, a sound that was less a command and more a rhythmic signal. In unison, they would lean into the ropes, digging their feet into the earth. The first movement was always the most profound, the most breathtaking moment. It was the instant when the immense, stubborn weight of the stone yielded to collective human effort. A deep grunt would erupt from the chests of 100 men, a vibration you could feel in your own bones, a shudder that ran through the very ground. And then it would begin to roll. An inch, then a foot, then a slow, relentless, grinding pace. The journey had begun. This procession was not just a line of men and a stone. It was a living river flowing through the heart of the land. People from the surrounding villages, hearing of its approach, would line the route. They didn't cheer or shout like you might expect at a parade. Theirs was a deep, reverent silence. They watched with awe, their faces solemn. As the stone passed, they would throw down fresh, green banana leaves and fragrant herbs in its path, creating a soft, sweet-smelling carpet for it to travel on. The stone, the future seat of their king, would travel on a bed of sweetness and respect. Mothers and fathers would hold their children up high, ensuring they could see the grey giant pass, to imprint this powerful image on their young memories. Elders, with faces etched by time and wisdom, would nod slowly, seeing in this new stone the echo of stones from reigns long, long past. They understood the continuity, the unbroken line of this tradition. The movement of the stone was punctuated by necessary rests. During these breaks, the pullers, exhausted but resolute, would be refreshed with cool banana wine and roasted plantain. Priests would walk around the stone, anointing it with sacred oils, speaking to its spirit in low tones, encouraging it on its way, asking it to be kind to the land it was traveling through. Let's just pause here for a moment. Close your eyes and listen. The fire crackles gently and the night breathes around us. Can you imagine the sounds of that procession? The deep, groaning creak of the logs bearing that incredible weight. The synchronized, powerful exhale of the pullers with every coordinated heave. The soft, rustling whisper of fresh leaves being crushed under the sledge. And above it all, the profound, watchful silence of the thousands who bore witness. It wasn't noise. It was a symphony of slow, deliberate, unified power. As the procession drew nearer to Mengo, the seat of the kingdom, its character began to change. The raw, agricultural effort transformed into a formal ceremony. From the palace, the royal drummers would begin to play, not a fast, celebratory beat, but a deep, rhythmic, resonant pattern that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was the heartbeat of the kingdom, calling its future throne home. The Kabaka's ministers and the heads of all the clans, dressed in their finest ceremonial attire, would leave the palace and join the final approach. Walking alongside the stone as it completed its journey, the stone's arrival at the palace gates was not an ending. It was a new beginning. It was carefully brought into the main courtyard and placed on a specially prepared earthen platform. This platform wasn't randomly placed. It was oriented with absolute precision to face the rising sun. And here, the stone would rest. It was left exposed to the elements, to the sun, the rain, the wind, and to the constant gaze of the royal court, for one full cycle of the moon. This period of waiting was crucial. The stone had to acclimatize. It had to settle. It had to exchange the wild spirit of the hill for the dignified spirit of the seat of power. It needed to learn the sounds of the palace, the constant rhythm of the drums, the heated debates of the Lukiko, the court assembly, the quiet whispers of intrigue that snaked through any center of power. In the same way, the future king would one day have to learn the language of the stone itself, its history, its strength, its permanence. By the end of this lunar vigil, after 28 days of listening and settling, the stone was no longer a visitor from a distant hill. It was home. It had become part of the palace's very fabric, Only then was it deemed ready. It was ready for the final artisans, the master carvers, to begin their meticulous, sacred work of shaping it into the specific seat, the Namulondo, the throne that would cradle a king and anchor a nation. This incredible story reminds us that the most powerful symbols are not just found, they are made. They are carried, honored, and imbued with meaning through human effort and shared belief. The Namulondo wasn't just a throne. It was the embodiment of the Buganda people's collective strength and spirit. The story of a king's throne usually ends the moment it's carved. A symbol of power, finished, permanent, waiting for its ruler. But for the Buganda, the story is different. The throne stone, once carved from the sacred hill of Negalabi, was not the end of the story. It was the first sentence. The philosophy of the Buganda people held that a king's legitimacy was unproven by his coronation. It was proven by his reign. Authority wasn't a static crown passed down, but a living, growing tree. Its true measure was stability. And from this profound idea, a unique tradition was born. For every 10 years of peace, prosperity, and just rule, a decade without famine-induced revolt, without crippling civil war, without the land itself crying out in discord, a new stone would be added to the base of the throne. The throne didn't just represent power, it recorded it. The very first embedding ceremony was always the most delicate. It could only occur after the 10th year of a Kabaka's successful reign. The stone for this edition was special, but it didn't come from Nagalabi. That source was reserved for the throne itself, the initial seat of power. This new stone was chosen from a different, equally significant place, the bed of the river Katonga. This river was a life-giving vein that flowed through the very heart of the Buganda kingdom. A river stone, smoothed and polished by the patient flow of water over countless centuries, symbolized a rain that was smoothing the rough edges of society, bringing a flowing, nurturing peace to the land. The stone had to be perfect, an oval shape without a single crack or flaw. It was not found by priests or royal diviners, but by children playing in the river, a powerful omen of innocence and a future secured for the next generation. The ceremony itself was a grand public affair, a major state event for all to witness. The Kabaka would preside, dressed in his full regalia, but he would not touch the stone. That sacred duty fell to the eldest living member of the Ngai clan, the Colobus monkey clan, which was associated with longevity and stability. Imagine the scene. An old man, his hands gnarled and weathered like the ancient roots of a baobab tree, would slowly lift the water-smoothed rock. He would then carefully fit it into a specially prepared socket at the front base of the massive granite throne. As the stone slid perfectly into place, a great, unified shout would erupt from the assembled multitude. Amazi, this single word, meaning the waters, was a powerful metaphor for a peace that flows, a peace that nourishes, a peace that sustains life. At that very moment, the throne physically grew. Its authority became visually, tangibly linked to demonstrable achievement. It was no longer just a seat of power. It was a living record of it. Let's pause for a moment here. Imagine we're sitting around a fire, the flames crackling gently as the cool night air breathes around us. Think about the profound patience this tradition demanded. A king could not simply command a stone to be added. He couldn't force it through conquest or decree. He could only cultivate the conditions, peace, justice, abundance that would earn it. His legacy was not written in scrolls or sung by court poets alone. It was written in geology at the patient, unhurried rate of one single rock per decade. This created a powerful, silent form of accountability. Every single time the Kabaka approached his throne to sit, to hold court, to make judgments, he would first see the stones at its feet, or, perhaps more importantly, the lack of them. If there were few stones, it spoke of a troubled or a very young reign, a stark, visual reminder of instability or challenges yet to be overcome. But if there were many stones, if they formed a layered foundation at the base of the great seat, it was a mountain of testimony. It was a silent, irrefutable chorus of approval from the land and its people. These stones were not trophies of conquest or symbols of battles won. They were witnesses. They were witnesses to harvests brought in safely, to disputes resolved justly under the shade of acacia trees, to children who grew up knowing only the security of their homesteads, not the fear of war. The throne became a living timeline, a geological record of the kingdom's well-being. To sit upon it was to sit upon history itself, history measured not in the number of enemies defeated, but in the number of wars that never had to be fought. This tradition fundamentally changed the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. The throne was not an object that separated the king from his people. It was an object that connected him directly to their collective experience. Each stone represented 10 years of shared prosperity. It was a physical manifestation of the social contract. The people weren't just subjects. They were participants in the king's legacy. Their well-being was the very material from which his authority was visibly constructed. A king with no stones at the base of his throne was a king on a precarious seat. He might have the title, the crown, and the palace, but he lacked the tangible proof of successful leadership. Conversely, a king with a foundation of many stones ruled with an authority that was almost unassailable, not because of fear, but because of a deep, earned respect. His power wasn't just inherited, it was validated by a generation of peace. Think of the psychological impact on neighboring kingdoms as well. A messenger or dignitary visiting the court of Buganda would just see a powerful king on a big chair. They would see a living monument to stability. A throne with 5, 6, or 7 embedded river stones told a story before the king even spoke a word. It said, "This kingdom has known peace for 50, 60, 70 years. This is a land of order, of patience, of strength that is not brittle or aggressive, but deep and enduring." It was a form of diplomacy written in stone. It communicated strength not through the rattling of spears, but through the quiet, solid presence of accumulated peace. It was a statement that this was a kingdom that knew how to govern itself, to feed its people, and to solve its problems without tearing itself apart. This tradition also instilled a long-term perspective in the kingdom's leadership. A ruler couldn't just think about immediate gains or short-term glory. He had to think in terms of decades. The ultimate prize wasn't a swift victory, but a lasting peace. This encouraged policies that were sustainable, just, and forward-thinking. It fostered a culture where the health of the land, the fairness of the courts, and the well-being of the common person were not just moral ideals, but strategic imperatives. To secure your legacy, you had to secure the future of your people. The stones were a constant, physical reminder that a ruler's true greatness was measured by the quiet, steady passage of peaceful years. Each stone was a decade of children growing to adulthood without knowing the horrors of war. A decade of farmers planting and harvesting with confidence. A decade of life flowing on, as steady and reliable as the river from which the stones themselves were drawn. The throne became more than just a piece of furniture. It was the heart of the nation's identity. It was a chronicle, a constitution, and a covenant, all carved into stone. It held the memory of the ancestors and the hopes for the future. Every new stone added was a renewal of the promise between the ruler and the people, a celebration of their shared success. It was a testament to the idea that the strongest foundations are not built from the spoils of war, but from the patient, steady accumulation of peace. A lesson in leadership, accountability, and the true meaning of power, written not in ink, but in stone, for all to see and understand. As the sun set and rose over the kingdom of Buganda, as generations came and went, the throne, the Namulondo, began to change. Not the great stone itself, but what lay beneath it. The simple plinth it once rested upon started to grow, to transform. It became a living testament to the kingdom's history, a complex, intricate jigsaw mosaic of rocks. Imagine this. With each passing decade of peace and prosperity, a new stone was carefully chosen and added to the foundation. These weren't just any stones. They were harvested from the bed of the Great Katonga River, each one unique, shaped and smoothed by the water's gentle, persistent embrace. Each stone carried its own story, its own color, its own texture. Some were the deep, almost black of basalt, mysterious and ancient. Others were a lighter granite, speckled with minerals that caught the light, like a constellation of tiny stars. There were flat stones, perfect for resting a hand upon, round ones like giant pebbles, and long, oblong ones that fit neatly into the gaps. Together, they formed an uneven but breathtakingly beautiful tapestry, a geological calendar of Buganda's golden ages. An elder, one who held the deep knowledge of the court, could, in theory, walk up to this foundation, point to a specific stone, and unravel a piece of the past. He might touch a dark, smooth rock and say, "This one, you see." This was added in the time of Kabaka Suna. That was the decade the coffee harvest was so bountiful that our traders reached the coast for the very first time, bringing back new goods and stories. Then, his finger would trace the outline of a shinier, quartz-veined stone. And this one marks the decade under the Great Mutesa Eye, when the first written word, the Arabic script, was introduced to the palace. A monumental change, and yet no blood was shed over it. It was a time of learning, of opening up to the world. This wasn't just a collection of rocks. It was the antithesis of a warrior's pillar or a conqueror's statue. Those monuments shout of victory, of dominance, of a single, violent moment. The Namulando's foundation whispered of something far more profound, quiet continuity. It celebrated the long, unbroken stretches of stability that allow a culture to truly flourish. During grand ceremonies, the court historians would sometimes stand before the throne, not to recount tales of war, but to gesture to these stones. They would recite the chronicles of peace associated with each edition. It was a powerful form of education for the new generation of chiefs and pages gathered there. The message was clear. The highest duty of a leader was not conquest, but consolidation. The ultimate goal was not glory in battle, but harmony at home. The throne itself, with its ever-growing foundation, taught that true, lasting strength was accretive. It was built slowly, patiently, layer by layer, much like the sedimentary rock that tells the Earth's own long, deep story. This visual record of peace also served as a profound and humbling force for incoming kings. Picture a young Kabaka, perhaps in his 20s, full of fire and ambition, eager to make his mark on the world. He would ascend to the throne. But before he could feel its full power, his eyes would be drawn downward to the base. He would see the dozens of stones added by his most illustrious predecessors. He would see the tangible legacy of their reigns, measured not in territory conquered, but in decades of peace secured. In that moment, he would understand the monumental scale of his task. To match that legacy, to earn his own place in that mosaic, he wouldn't need a single glorious victory. He would need 10, 20, or even 30 years of peace. It was a powerful redefinition of royal ambition. It shifted the focus from a short, violent flash of brilliance to a long, steady, life-giving glow. The throne itself became the kingdom's chief counselor. Its silent, stony voice was a constant advocate for patience, for wisdom, for the kind of steady, thoughtful rule that results in another smooth river rock being gently, reverently added to the collective memory of the kingdom. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine yourself in the great hall, the fire crackling softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The night is quiet outside, and the air is thick with history. Look at that mosaic of stones at the base of the throne. Each one represents a decade of ordinary, glorious days. A decade of dawns where farmers could go to their fields without fear. A decade of nights where families gathered to tell stories instead of huddling together, listening for the sounds of war. Each stone is a monument to the simple, profound beauty of a life lived in peace, the very days that history so often forgets to name, focusing instead on the drama of conflict. These stones remembered, they honored the quiet times, the building times, the times when life was simply allowed to be good. The culture that blossomed around this tradition was one that placed a profound, almost sacred value on stability. Peace became the paramount political virtue, the highest achievement a leader could strive for. This had a ripple effect throughout the entire kingdom. When clan disputes arose, they were settled with greater urgency. It wasn't just about dispensing justice. It was about protecting the precious, accumulating timeline of the throne. A decade lost to internal conflict or a reckless war was more than just a period of hardship. It was a stone that would never be added. It was a permanent gap in the historical record, a silent, ugly scar on the very foundation of the kingdom. The absence of a stone would speak volumes for centuries to come. A quiet indictment of a leader's failure to maintain harmony. Through this simple yet ingenious tradition, the Namulondo actively shaped the very psyche of the state. It transformed the Buganda people into architects of durability, into masons of time itself. They weren't just building a kingdom for the present. They were consciously and meticulously building a legacy of peace for the future. Every decision, from mediating a local quarrel to engaging in diplomacy with neighboring peoples, was weighed against a simple, powerful question. Will this action help us add another stone? Will this choice contribute to another decade of peace, allowing our children and grandchildren to thrive? This focus on peace bred a unique kind of strength. It wasn't the brittle strength of a kingdom built on fear and domination, which can shatter in an instant. It was the flexible, resilient strength of a society that knows how to resolve conflict, how to compromise, and how to value the well-being of the whole over the ambition of a few. The throne taught that the greatest battles were not fought with spears, but with words, with wisdom, and with a deep, abiding commitment to the common good. And so, the foundation grew. Decade by decade, stone by stone, the mosaic spread, a beautiful, tangible map of Buganda's soul. It was a story written not in ink, but in granite and basalt. It was a history measured not by the reigns of kings, but by the rhythm of peaceful decades. The Namulondo was more than just a seat of power. It was a teacher, a guide, and a constant. Enduring reminder that the most powerful legacy a leader can leave behind is not a monument of conquest, but a simple, smooth stone representing a time when the people knew peace. Before a new Kabaka of Buganda could wear the crown and hold the royal spear, before the world would bow to him as king, he had to undertake a journey inward into the very heart of what it meant to rule. This was not a public spectacle, but a deeply personal, solitary ritual. In the quiet hours, when the palace was still and the shadows grew long, the Kabaka would be led to the throne room. He would be stripped of all the finery and symbols of his imminent power, dressed only in simple, humble barcloth. In this state of pure simplicity, he would stand before the Namulondo, the great stone throne. He was not yet a ruler approaching his seat of power. He was a supplicant, a student, an apprentice to history itself. For what seemed like an eternity, he would simply stand there, or perhaps circle the massive throne slowly, his bare feet silent on the cool floor. His tutors, the wise elders of the kingdom, would have already filled his mind with the stories of each smooth, river-worn stone embedded in the base of the throne. Each stone was a chronicle, a testament to a decade of his ancestors' rule. Now, alone in the echoing silence, it was his turn not just to know these stories, but to feel them. To feel their collective weight pressing not on his shoulders, but on his very soul. This weight was not merely physical, though the throne was an immense and solid mass of rock. No, this was the weight of history, the crushing, profound burden of expectation. Imagine it. Each stone he looked at represented a time when one of his forefathers faced down famine, a time another repelled an external invasion, or masterfully navigated the treacherous waters of internal rivalry. Each stone was a victory against the sheer, grinding inertia of daily governance. They were symbols of survival, of resilience, of a kingdom that didn't just endure, but thrived under their guidance. To sit on that throne, he was now realizing, was not a right. It was an agreement, a solemn contract to accept the responsibility to add another stone to that collection. It was a promise to become the next strong link in an unbroken chain of stability that stretched back through the mists of time. When he would eventually sit, the physical act of his body resting upon that ancient rock was a ritual acceptance of this intangible burden. He was agreeing to carry the weight of all the peace, all the prosperity, all the difficult decisions that had come before him, and to ensure they were not in vain. The throne taught a fundamental lesson, a lesson in what we might call symbiotic weight. It was a relationship of mutual support. The stone held the king up, literally elevating him above all others, granting him the physical manifestation of his authority. It was the foundation of his power. But in return, the king had to hold up the meaning of the stone. He had to validate its sacredness, its very reason for being, through his actions, his wisdom, and his justice. The throne gave him power, but he, in turn, gave the throne its continued relevance and sanctity. If a king failed in this sacred duty, if his reign brought chaos, weakness, or injustice, the throne itself did not crumble. It didn't change at all. It remained solid, silent, and in its silence, it judged it would stand as a stark, unmoving witness to his failure. A future king, standing where our young man now stands, would one day look upon the base of the throne and see a gap. He would see a missing piece in the foundation, a missing tooth in the smile of history where the stone from that failed reign should have been. The throne was therefore both a support and a stern judge. It was a source of immense power and, at the same time, a perfect mirror of accountability. There was no hiding from its silent verdict. Let's just pause here for a moment. Can you feel it? The air in that throne room, cool on the skin. The only sound is the gentle crackle of a distant fire, the soft breathing of the night outside the palace walls. The silence inside is heavy, not empty. It's filled with the whispers of past councils, the echoes of judgments past, the ghosts of decisions that shaped the destiny of millions. Try to imagine the cocktail of emotions churning in that young man's heart. The overwhelming awe at the sheer scale of the history before him, mixed with a profound, chilling dread. The dread of knowing that the future of this entire legacy now rested squarely on his shoulders. He was standing at the convergence of the past and the future, and he was the pivot upon which everything would turn. This solitary contemplation, this silent communion with the throne, was the final and most important piece of a king's education. It was more valuable than any lesson in statecraft or warfare. Why? Because it systematically stripped away any illusion of power as a personal privilege. It demolished the idea that being king was about wealth, or glory, or personal comfort. Instead, it framed power for what it truly was: a temporary stewardship of an eternal continuum. He was not the owner of the kingdom. He was its caretaker. He was borrowing the throne from his ancestors and holding it in trust for his descendants. When the day of the coronation finally arrived, this lesson would be seared into his memory forever. As the ceremonies reached their climax, he would be lowered onto the stone surface of the Namulondo. But just before, the throne would often be cooled with blessed water. As his body made contact with the seat, the shock of the cold rock against his skin would be sudden and intense. It was a physical jolt, a permanent, unforgettable reminder of this night of contemplation. It was the chill of history, the cold, hard reality of his responsibility entering his very bones. From that moment onward, everything changed. His life was no longer his own. His personal warmth, his vitality, his energy, all of it would now be spent in the service of a singular goal: to ensure that the legacy of that stone, the legacy of stability and peace, grew warmer, grew larger, and grew stronger for the generations to come. He had to ensure that future princes, standing where he once stood, would see not a gap, but a new, solid stone bearing the mark of his own successful reign. The throne, in its profound wisdom, made every king a gardener. He was not a conqueror building an empire of sand, but a patient cultivator, tending to the slow-growing tree of national peace. His success would not be measured in the gold in his treasury or the lands he conquered. It would be measured in the simple, humble fruit of river-smoothed rocks added to the base of the eternal throne. Each stone a story, each stone a promise kept, each stone a decade of peace for his people. The weight of the crown was nothing compared to the weight of the stone. And in bearing that weight with grace and wisdom, he would not just be a king, but a true Kabaka, a worthy ancestor in the great chain of Buganda's history. Imagine a world arriving on the shores of Lake Nalyabali in the late 19th century. A world that spoke a language the ancient stone throne, the Namulondo, simply could not understand. This wasn't the language of ritual, of spirit, or of community. It was a new language, one of ledgers and contracts, of maps drawn with rigid, straight lines, a language of acquisition. To these new men, clad in stiff, sun-bleached cloth, the Namulondo was not a sacred covenant, a living link between the earth, the king, and the people. No, to them, it was merely an artifact, a curiosity. It was a symbol of a power they fully intended to supersede, to overwrite. They saw its immense weight not as spiritual gravity, but as mere tonnage to be measured and recorded. They saw its ancient age not as a vessel of wisdom, but as primitive antiquity, something to be studied and catalogued. When the winds of colonial conquest finally settled, solidifying into the rigid structure of administrative control, the throne became a target. Its removal wasn't a chaotic byproduct of war. It was a cold, calculated, symbolic act. Think about it. To take the throne was to send a chilling message. It was a proclamation that the very bedrock of Buganda's authority, the source of its legitimacy, could now be moved, possessed, and displayed by another power. It was an act of profound psychological warfare, aimed at the very heart of the kingdom. The British officers in their pith helmets, standing in the Mengo Palace courtyard, looked at the throne with an air of clinical appraisal, like scientists examining a specimen. Meanwhile, the Buganda court officials stood by, their faces a tragic canvas of anger, frustration, and utter helplessness. Their world was being dismantled before their very eyes, and the symbol of its endurance was being sized up for removal. The mechanics of the theft itself were a brutal shock to the senses of the palace, an act of sheer, unceremonious force. Men arrived with block and tackle, with heavy iron chains that clanked and echoed through the courtyard. It was a sound entirely alien to the soft, respectful atmosphere of the court, a sound of industry and subjugation. These men performed no rituals of apology to the earth from which the throne was to be torn. They didn't listen for the stone's spirit or acknowledge its sacredness. Instead, they drilled directly into its base, scarring the ancient granite to attach their lifting hooks. The groan of the stone as it was first wrenched from the platform, its home for countless generations, was a sound that resonated deep in the chests of every single person watching. It was the sound of a root, a taproot of a whole culture, being violently torn from the soil. The small, embedded river stones, each one a testament to a peaceful transfer of power. The very timeline of the kingdom's stability were pried out unceremoniously. They were collected in rough burlap sacks, treated like common gravel, their significance completely lost. The throne was then loaded onto a heavy cart, a final, stinging insult. It was not carried by people in a procession of reverence. It was pulled by straining oxen, treated as nothing more than dead weight. Its procession this time was not one of celebration, but of hollow victory, as it rolled slowly away from the palace, towards a waiting ship on the lake. The Buganda people watched from a distance, their faces etched with a grief and disbelief so profound it felt like the sky itself was falling. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine the scene. The fire crackles gently as the night breathes around us. Can you hear it? That terrible, grinding sound of stone being forced against its will. And then the silence. The silence that fell over the palace courtyard afterward was deeper and more terrifying than any silence that had come before. This wasn't peace. It was an absence, a void, a gaping hole where a heart had once been. The spiritual center of the kingdom had been ripped out, and its echo was a profound and haunting emptiness. The ship's hold was a dark, salty belly. The Namulondo, wrapped in rough, dismissive tarpaulin, crossed the Great Lake. From there, it traveled by rail to the coast, and was then loaded onto a great ocean-going vessel. With every mile that passed, it moved further and further from the context that gave it life, that gave it meaning. It traveled from a land of brilliant sun and gentle mist into a world of perpetual damp and grey. The people it passed now, the dock workers, the sailors, the railway men, they saw only a large, oddly shaped piece of cargo, an inconveniently heavy stone. Its sacredness seemed to evaporate in the salty sea air, leaving only cold, inert mass. It finally arrived in London during a season of relentless rain. The throne was taken to a vast museum, a grand palace of stolen sleep, a repository of treasures taken from their homes. Here, it was placed in a hall dedicated to ethnographic artifacts. It sat there, stranded between a totem pole from a distant Pacific island and a glass case filled with ceremonial masks from a South American forest. A small, typed card was placed beside it. The card read, "Royal Throne, Buganda Kingdom. Late 19th C granite." That was it. That was all. The sacred geography of Nagalabi Hill. The long genealogy of kings. The decades of peace measured in river stones, all of it, an entire universe of meaning, was reduced to 3 terse lines of text. The stone sat, but it did not throne. It couldn't. To throne is an action, a state of being connected to a people and a land. Here, under the flat, artificial electric light, it merely existed. It was observed by thousands of curious eyes that saw a relic of a conquered past, an interesting piece of primitive art. They did not, and could not, see the living heart of an enduring people. The stone, which once pulsed with the life of a kingdom, now sat silent, a prisoner of classification, its spirit held captive in a foreign land, a testament not to its own history, but to the power that had stolen it. In the museum, the Namulondo entered a kind of suspended animation. The great hall was never truly dark, nor was it ever truly quiet. The murmur of visitors was a constant, meaningless buzz, a sound without substance. The air was dry, controlled, completely devoid of the humid, living breath of the lake region it had come from. The stone, which had once been cooled by morning mist and warmed by the sun filtering through palace reed screens, now existed in a perpetual, sterile twilight. Its surface, which had once held the warmth of a king's body and the sacred oils of anointing ceremonies, grew uniformly cool, collecting a fine layer of dust. It was no longer a throne. It was an object of study, a subject for photography. Scholars would arrive to measure it, to sketch its form, to write papers debating the symbolism of its shape, entirely missing its point. Its power was never in its symbolism, but in its very being, and in this place it could not be a throne. It could only be a specimen, pinned under glass like a butterfly. Children on school trips, when the guards weren't looking, would run their sticky fingers over its carved edges, leaving smudges. Tourists, eager for a novel photo, would lean against it, their brief, bright laughter echoing up to the high, vaulted ceiling. The stone absorbed it, or the indifference, the fleeting curiosity, the profound ignorance of its history, the sheer geographical dislocation. Its spirit, the Buganda would say, went to sleep. It withdrew deep into the heart of the granite, dreaming. It dreamt of the hill of its birth, of the feel of smooth river stones at its feet, of the comforting weight of a lineage it was designed to bear. But here it bore nothing. It was weight without purpose, mass without meaning. It was a king in exile, stripped of its kingdom, forced to wear the invisible, suffocating robes of a museum piece. Yet, even in its silent dormancy, a subtle resistance remained, a quiet rebellion. Museum curators would sometimes note, in their meticulous logs, a peculiar phenomenon. The dust on the throne seemed to settle in strange, concentric patterns, almost like ripples, as if disturbed by a faint, regular vibration no one could feel. The air around it was often described in reports as still, but heavy. Cleaners complained that the stone was always colder to the touch than the surrounding air. Even in the height of summer, was it merely dense stone holding the night's chill, a simple matter of physics? Or was the throne, in its deep, stony sleep, still pulling towards a different magnetic north, towards the hills of Buganda, towards the specific longitude and latitude of its purpose? It became, for the few who noticed, a slightly uncomfortable object. Not frightening, not a haunting, but something profoundly. Elsewhere, its presence was a quiet hole in the fabric of the museum's reality, a small pocket of alien gravity that didn't belong. It was a silent testament to a world beyond the labeled and categorized displays. Imagine the scene at night. Inside the empty museum, moonlight streams through a high window, a single silvery beam illuminating only the stone throne. It sits in profound solitude, shadows pooling around its base like dark water. A continent away from the sound of night insects and the whisper of banana leaves in the breeze. Its sleep is not restful, but patient. A stone waiting for its story to resume. Decades passed, the world outside the museum fought wars, redrew borders, forgot and remembered its own histories in cycles. The small, typewritten card next to the throne yellowed at the edges. Newer, more sensational artifacts were acquired, drawing the crowds away to other halls. The throne's wing became a quiet backwater of the museum, a place for dusty contemplation rather than active viewing. It was during this long, deepening silence that the stone's exile reached its peak and then turned. Because in the deepest silence, the most profound journeys can begin. unseen and unheard. While the museum slept, and the thick London fog pressed against the windows like a shroud, the stone began, impossibly, to dream its way home. Not through maps or ships, not through human hands or political negotiations, but through the older, more ancient pathways of memory and belonging, where geography is a feeling and distance is simply a state of mind. The journey had begun. It didn't come back with a grand announcement or a formal ceremony. There was no fanfare, no procession. Its return was a discovery, a moment of pure, unadulterated shock in the quiet hours before dawn. A palace guardsman, a young man making his very first pre-dawn rounds of the Mengo courtyard, was the first to see it. He stopped dead in his tracks. The grey light of the approaching sunrise was still weak, painting the world in shades of charcoal and silver. But it was enough. It was enough to reveal a shape that absolutely should not have been there. A massive, familiar silhouette sitting directly on the main steps leading to the palace's audience chamber. He took a hesitant step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a drum. He knew that shape. Every child of the kingdom knew that shape. It was the Namulondo, unmistakable. It was back. Think about that for a second. It wasn't on a ship's manifest. It wasn't part of a diplomatic handover. No colonial official stood there, making a grand gesture of return, eager to be photographed for the papers. It was simply there, as if it had sprouted from the stone steps overnight, a great, silent presence that had willed itself back into existence. The guardsman just stood there, frozen, his spear held loosely in his hand, staring in utter awe at the massive stone throne. The sky behind it was turning a pale grey and pink, and the entire scene was utterly, profoundly still. It was a moment suspended outside of time, as he slowly, cautiously dared to approach. The first thing he noticed wasn't a sight, but a smell. It wasn't the dry, stale scent of museum dust that he might have expected. It was the sharp, tangy scent of the ocean. Salt, a smell that had no business being here, hundreds of miles inland. The stone of the throne was wet, beaded with moisture that was clearly not the morning dew clinging to the grass. It gleamed darkly in the faint light, and when he reached out a trembling hand and hesitantly touched its surface, his fingers came away damp. He brought them to his lips. Sea brine, salty, like a tear. The second thing he noticed was its placement. This was just as strange as its sudden appearance. It wasn't resting on its original platform, the sacred spot that had sat empty for decades, a constant, painful reminder of its absence. Instead, it was on the steps, placed deliberately, as if it had been carefully set down by an impossibly strong, invisible hand. Or perhaps as if it had arrived under its own power and had chosen this intermediate place itself, a place that was neither fully inside the palace nor fully outside in the world, neither completely returned nor just visiting for a day. It was a statement, and around its base, something that made his breath catch in his throat. The embedded river stones, the ones that had been pried from the earth when the throne was taken, were back, fitted perfectly, completing the mosaic around its base as if they had never been disturbed. They, too, were dark and damp with salt water. Word of its return didn't spread like a shout from the rooftops. It traveled like a whisper on the wind, a collective gasp that seemed to move from house to house, from heart to heart, without a sound. By the time the sun had fully risen, casting golden light across the courtyard, a crowd had gathered. They were held back by a hastily formed perimeter of stunned chiefs, their faces a mixture of disbelief and reverence. No one dared approach too closely. They just stood, a silent, watching assembly, their eyes fixed on the impossible sight. Everyone was looking for an explanation, for some sign of how it had gotten there. But there was nothing. No tracks from a heavy lorry in the soft earth, no marks on the stone steps from being dragged or lifted. Not a single person had seen or heard anything during the night. It was an event without a process, a conclusion without a journey, an answer without a question ever being asked. When the colonial officials finally arrived, summoned by an urgent, stammering messenger, they were utterly baffled. More than baffled, they were deeply unsettled. This wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was a challenge to their entire worldview. They were men of ledgers, of schedules, of logic and order. They immediately launched an investigation. They checked the ports, they interrogated dock workers, they reviewed railway manifests. They found nothing. No ship had docked with a cargo of that size and weight. No train had carried it across the country. The throne's return was an administrative impossibility. It was a fact that stood in direct defiance of the neat, predictable world they had built and so carefully managed. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine that scene. The fire crackles gently, the night breathes around us. Can you feel it? That profound, communal silence of pure awe that fell over the crowd at Mengo? The impossible smell of sea salt carried on the morning air, so far from any coast. This wasn't just a mystery to be solved like some cheap detective novel. It was a mystery so complete, so total, that it felt less like a puzzle and more like a miracle. It felt like reality itself had bent, just for a moment, to make a correction, to right a deep and profound wrong. In the wide shot of the palace courtyard at midday, you can see the two worlds colliding. On one side, the crowd of Buganda people, standing at a respectful distance, their faces full of wonder, gazing at the throne. On the other side, a small cluster of colonial officials in their stiff suits and hats, looking utterly confused, gesturing wildly, and consulting their clipboards as if the answer could be found in their paperwork. It couldn't, because the Buganda were not looking for a rational explanation. They didn't need one. They understood what had happened in a language older than shipping manifests and colonial bureaucracy. They understood it in the language of spirit, of ancestors, and of the land itself. The throne had come home. Its long sleep in the cold, sterile museum had been just that, a sleep. A long dream of the ocean it had been forced to cross. And now it had woken up. It had walked the older paths, the paths of memory, the pathways of belonging that transcend physical geography and mortal maps. The salt clinging to its stone body was the proof of its journey. Not a journey by steamship and railway, but by a more ancient, more powerful route. For the people, this was a sign that the covenant between the king, the people, and the land, though it had been violated, was not broken. The land had called its stone back. The kingdom's heart, ripped from its chest decades ago, had finally returned. The officials, frustrated and unable to find a single piece of evidence, eventually just gave up. They filed a report citing unknown native activity and quietly let the matter drop. Secretly, they were probably relieved. That throne had always made them uneasy. It held a power they couldn't quantify or control, and now it was no longer their problem. For the people of the kingdom, however, the return wasn't a victory to be celebrated with loud cheers and parades. It was a profound truth to be absorbed, to be felt deep in their bones. So they did not cheer. Instead, they brought offerings. Freshly cut banana leaves were laid carefully on the steps. Bowls of fresh milk were placed around the base. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones. The throne was back, wet with the tears of the ocean and the sweat of its long, impossible journey. It was home, and its return, this quiet, inexplicable miracle, changed everything, especially for the one man who was now, by destiny, fated to sit upon it. His story was about to truly begin. For 7 days and 7 nights, the throne sat on the palace steps. The sun baked the ocean from its ancient pores, and the spirit of the land slowly re-inhabited its stony heart. Then, with immense ceremony, it was moved. Using the old log and rope method, the people pulled together once more, hauling it back to its original platform in the throne room. The throne was whole again, but the world was not. The Buganda it returned to was a kingdom within a nation, a monarchy whose political teeth had been blunted by history, by colonialism, by independence and its turbulent aftermath. The man who was now Kabaka, Mwenda Mutibi II, was a king for a different time. Educated across continents, fluent in worlds his ancestors could not have imagined. He faced not just a simple seat of power, but a returned monument of unimaginable moral and historical weight. He would often come alone to the throne room, standing before it for long periods. He studied the newly restored mosaic of river stones, each one representing a decade of hard-won peace from a different age. He would touch the cold granite, feeling the pits and grooves worn down by time and sacred anointing oils. He knew its story intimately, the sacred quarry where it was born, the foundation that grew with each rain, the theft that tore it away, and its mysterious return across the sea. And in that deep knowledge, he felt a profound dissonance, a deep conflict. The throne represented an absolute earth-anchored authority from an era when a king's word was the final law of the land, backed by the unyielding certainty of stone. But his world was one of parliaments and constitutions, of relentless media and global pressures. It was a world of compromise, of nuance, of fragile consensus. He felt that to sit on the Namulondo now would be to make a promise he could not possibly keep. It would be to claim a kind of power that was no longer his to wield, and perhaps a power that should no longer belong to anyone. The throne's power felt too immense, too concentrated, too old for these fragmented, diminished times. It was like a lightning rod for a kind of spiritual voltage that the modern political landscape could not safely earth. To sit on it would be to risk being consumed by the expectations of the past, or worse, to diminish the throne itself by subjecting it to the petty squabbles of the present. He felt the weight of his legacy, not as a burden to be shouldered, but as a sacred object to be protected. The throne had survived theft. It had crossed oceans by means unknown. Its very survival was its own message. It was no longer a tool for governance. It was a testament to endurance. And so, a new understanding began to form in his mind. A king's duty was not to use this testament, but to preserve it for the meaning it held for all the people. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine the fire crackling gently as the night breathes around us. Feel the quiet of that throne room, the weight of centuries held within the stone, and the weight of a monumental decision resting on one man. A modern mind grappling with an ancient force. He consulted the elders, the clan heads, the historians. The opinions were deeply divided. Some urged him to take his rightful seat, to reconnect the broken circuit of power and show the world that the kingdom was truly restored. Others, often the quietest and the oldest among them, simply nodded when he expressed his doubts. They understood that sometimes the greatest respect you can show a powerful thing is to acknowledge that its time of active use has passed. Its new purpose is to become a teacher, a mirror, a monument. The throne had returned not to command, but to remind. It was now the Kabaka's task to interpret that reminder for his people, and his interpretation would lead to a decision that would redefine the throne's purpose for a new age. A decision that would echo through the future of his kingdom. The decision was made public not with a decree, but with an action. Imagine the scene. The next major court ceremony was held, the air thick with anticipation. The Kabaka, the king, entered the throne room. He was a figure of pure majesty, regal in his traditional white kansu and resplendent royal robes. Every eye was on him. The assembled chiefs, dignitaries, and honored guests watched, waiting for the familiar ritual. They waited for him to ascend the low platform to the Namulondo, the ancient stone throne, the very heart of the kingdom. But he did not. Instead, in a move that silenced the entire hall, he walked to the side of the platform. There, a new seat had been placed. It was a chair, yes, but what a chair! It was carved from a single, majestic enviol tree, its wood polished to a deep, warm glow that seemed to hold the sunlight within it. The design was elegantly simple, yet profoundly meaningful. Subtle carvings of royal symbols, the drum, the shield, the spear adorned its frame. It was beautiful, dignified, and unmistakably a chair. It was not a throne cut from the living hill, and as the court looked on, the Kabaka sat down upon it. A ripple went through the room. First, it was a soft wave of surprise, a collective intake of breath. Then, like dawn breaking over the horizon, understanding bloomed on the faces of those present. The gesture was breathtaking. It was an act of profound humility, yet it was also an assertion of a new kind of power. By choosing the wooden chair, the Kabaka was making several powerful statements all at once, without uttering a single word. First, and most obviously, he was protecting the stone throne. He was shielding the sacred Namulondo from the inevitable compromises and conflicts of daily rule. He was preserving its sanctity, lifting it above the political fray. It would no longer be a seat for a mortal man engaged in worldly affairs. It would be something more. Second, he was fundamentally redefining his own authority. His power, he was declaring, would not come from the unyielding ancient earth symbolized by the stone. It would come from the living tree, something that grows, that adapts, that can bend in the wind without breaking, that provides shade and shelter for all who seek it. This was a shift from a power of dominance to a power of service. It was the authority of a steward, not a master. And third, perhaps most importantly, he was creating an entirely new relationship between the king and the throne. He was no longer its occupant. He was now its guardian. He ruled not from the throne, but alongside it. The stone throne, the Namulondo, became the silent senior partner in the governance of the kingdom. It was the eternal witness, the repository of history and ancestral wisdom. The wooden chair, in contrast, became the active seat of contemporary stewardship, the place where the present was navigated, where decisions were made for the living, all under the watchful gaze of the past. This was not a demotion of the Namulondo. Far from it. This was its ultimate elevation. It was no longer just a piece of royal furniture, however sacred. It became a monument. It was a museum piece in the very best sense of the word, but one that remained in its own home, where its context was alive and vibrant, not sterile and removed. Its power was no longer political in the day-to-day sense. It became moral and historical. The stone throne became the ultimate yardstick, the standard against which all actions of the king and the kingdom were to be measured. From that day forward, when the Kabaka held court from his new wooden chair, the empty stone throne beside him was a constant, silent question. It loomed over every proceeding, a powerful presence in its very emptiness. Does this decision honor the peace of the stones? Does this judgment add to the stability they represent? Does this new law serve the continuity of our people? The empty throne was a presence more powerful than it could ever be with a sitting king. Because now it represented not an individual, but an ideal. It embodied the collective soul and history of the Buganda kingdom. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine us sitting around a crackling fire, the gentle sounds of the night breathing around us. Let the story settle. Consider the sheer courage of that choice, to willingly, publicly, step away from the literal, physical seat of ultimate power, to invent a new symbol from a different element, a living one, all to honor the past more truly and secure the future more wisely. It is a profound lesson in leadership, showing that true strength sometimes lies not in occupying a position, but in preserving it. It's leadership as an act of preservation, of guardianship. And the people understood. They saw what was happening with a clarity that bypassed intellectual debate and went straight to the heart. They did not see a king who was refusing his throne or diminishing his own stature. They saw a king who respected the throne so profoundly that he refused to reduce it to a mere chair for his personal use. They saw a leader with a wisdom that understood that some powers are too great, too ancient, to be wielded directly. They must be reflected like moonlight on water, rather than grasped tightly like a spear. The new wooden chair quickly earned a name. It became known as the Guardian's Seat. It was the seat of the one who watched over the true heart of the kingdom, and the stone throne, the Namulondo, in its magnificent emptiness, became more present, more potent than ever before. It was no longer the Kabaka's throne, belonging to one man for the duration of his reign. It was now Buganda's throne. It belonged to every single person who looked upon it and saw their own history, their endurance, their resilience. They saw their own returned heart, sitting there in silent, stony majesty, eternal and unshakable. It was a throne for the entire nation, a symbol of their collective identity, forever guarded, forever revered. This simple act of moving a seat transformed the entire political and spiritual landscape of the kingdom. It taught a timeless lesson that true power isn't about sitting in the highest chair, but about ensuring that the foundations upon which that chair rests are strong, respected, and preserved for all generations to come. It's about understanding what must be held in your hands and what must be held in your heart. Today, the Namulondo sits in its palace. It is not roped off, it is not behind glass, it is accessible. On certain days, people from all walks of life, farmers from Masaka, students from Makarere, grandmothers from the islands of the lake are allowed to file quietly into the throne room. They do not come to see a king, they come to see the stone. They approach it slowly. Many kneel, some reach out and touch the cool granite, their fingers tracing the same grooves touched by kings and priests for centuries. They lean down to look at the mosaic of river stones, the geological timeline of their own survival. They speak to it in whispers, not as to an idol, but as to a grandfather who has seen everything. They tell it their hopes, their worries for their children, their gratitude for the peace that allowed them to come here. This is a profound shift in the life of the Namulenda. For generations, its power was singular, a conduit for the authority of one man, the Kabaka. Only the king could touch it, sit upon it. Its energy was a focused beam, radiating downwards from the ruler to his subjects. But now, something entirely different is happening. The throne has become a living archive of touch, of emotion. It absorbs the prayers and the memories of the people. Its power, which once flowed downward from a seated king, now flows outward in a circle, from the stone to the people and back again. It has become a focal point for national identity, but of a gentle, reflective kind. This isn't the loud, flag-waving nationalism we often see. This is something quieter, deeper. The Namulondo does not scream of nationalism. It whispers of continuity. Its very presence says, "We were here, we were taken, we returned, we endure." This transformation is most visible in the way the next generation interacts with it. Children are brought to the throne room to learn history not from books, but from texture and temperature. They run their small hands over its surface. They are taught that this stone was stolen, spirited away to a foreign land. They learn that it came back, mysteriously, wet with sea salt, a journey shrouded in legend. and they are told that this return, this mystery, belongs to them now. It is a story they must carry forward, a piece of their inheritance. And what of the king, the Kabaka? From a simple wooden chair set to the side, he watches this beautiful interaction. He is the guardian, not the occupier. He sees that his decision, his radical act of stepping aside, has given the throne back to its true owners, the people of Buganda. The throne's emptiness is precisely what allows everyone to find a piece of themselves in it. If he were to sit upon it, it would be his seat, his story. But by remaining empty, it becomes theirs. It is a communal heart made of stone. The ultimate symbol of the kingdom is no longer a king on a throne, but a throne with a king beside it, and a people all around it. This is the new covenant. It's not a pact between a king and the land, but between a people and their past, mediated by a stone that refused to stay lost. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine the scene. The fire crackles gently, and the quiet of the night breathes around us. The story of the Namulondo has come full circle. It began on a sacred hill, a piece of the earth itself. It moved to a palace, becoming a symbol of royal power. It was then stolen, exiled to a distant museum, a sterile object under glass. Then, its miraculous, salt-wet return, a journey of dreams and destiny. And now, its final form, an empty monument, open to all. The throne's journey is the kingdom's biography, written in granite and river stones. And its final, silent lesson is perhaps the most powerful of all, that the greatest strength is sometimes found not in use, but in reverence, not in occupation, but in preservation. The stone has spoken its last word for tonight. It sits in our mind's eye, cool and eternal. It is not just a relic of the past, it is a companion to time, a silent listener, a patient witness that grew from the hill, was added to in times of peace, was stolen, and then dreamed its way home. And now it rests, complete, teaching a new kind of power through the profound dignity of its stillness. The throne is no longer something to be sat upon, it is something to be understood. And in that understanding, an entire people find their anchor, their connection to who they were, who they are, and who they will become. It is a story of loss, of return, and ultimately of a power that is strongest when it is shared. So we arrive at the end of our telling. Here, under the quiet spread of these baobab skies, the embers of our fire glow low, mirroring the last light of understanding in our minds. We have followed not a person, but a stone, a piece of earth that became the soul of a kingdom. We have seen it chosen in a sacred dialogue between priests and a trembling hillside. We have watched it grow, not in size, but in meaning, as each smooth river rock embedded at its base marked a decade of peace, a calendar written not in ink, but in geology. We felt the violation of its theft, the chill of its exile under foreign glass, where it slept and dreamed of home. And we witnessed the mystery of its return, salt-wet and silent on the palace steps, a journey that defied ships and maps, a correction written by the land itself. Finally, we saw a modern king, faced with this returned mountain of history, make a choice of breathtaking humility. To not sit, to guard, not occupy, to rule from a chair of wood beside the throne of stone, transforming it from a seat of power into a monument of memory. In its emptiness, it became more full of the touches, whispers, and prayers of a people reclaiming their story. The tale of the stone throne of Buganda is, in the end, a story about true power. It teaches that real authority is not about the unyielding grip, but about the ability to hold something sacred in trust. That legitimacy is earned, not in moments of conquest, but in the slow, patient accumulation of peaceful days. That the most profound returns are often not explained, but felt in the soul of a nation. The throne now sits, as it began, a piece of the earth in the House of Kings. But its meaning has transcended its form. It is no longer just the Namulondo. It is a teacher, a mirror, an anchor. It reminds us that identity is rooted in geography and memory, that endurance is a spiritual force, and that sometimes the most powerful statement a leader can make is to step aside so that the people may step forward and see their own reflection in the stone. Let the image of it rest in your mind, now solid, silent, complete, a testament to what endures, a promise that some covenants, though tested across oceans and eras, cannot be broken. They simply wait, in stone and story, to be remembered. The night is deep. The fire is but gentle coals. The story is told. You are under baobab skies. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others. We'll meet again for another tale.